All right, the season is over. Finals are over. Trade and draft are all done. So now let's take our last look at every team's 2024 as a whole before we tick over into 2025. But before we do that, remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you like our content. If you don't, you'll probably just comment maybe. But let's crack into North Melbourne. This season review is brought to you by Skills Beast, the best teaching apparatus to learn how to kick effectively with the correct technique every time. No matter what your age or skill level, Skills Beast will transform your kick. Head to skillsbeast.com to instantly kick better. Joining me for the North Melbourne season review is Darren Parkin, AFL commentator and analyst. Darren, how are you?
Going well, yeah. It's very numbers heavy, I guess, if we look at North and, on face value, it looks about the same and statistically probably a little more than they were the year before, but I'm not sure that's true. They conceded more, their percentage was worse. If you look at the differences, though, last year they won their first two under Alistair Clarkson and then lost 20 in a row before they beat the Suns in the last round when Larkey kicked 9. This year was a bit different. They started awfully and then looked like they found their feet. Some of the statistics around contested ball, which we'll discuss throughout it, but a bit of a sour taste in the last fortnight, but if you break the season in half, first 11 rounds, they conceded over 100 points in every game. They looked a chance of doing it for the entire season.
That's crazy.
7 of their last 8, they did the same. Their average losing margin in the first half of the year was 54 points, with 6 at 55 or higher. And look, last year they lost 6 close games by less than 2 goals, only 3 this year. And if you look at run-ons, so 5 goals in a quarter, they did it 9 times this year, but conceded it 37 times. So all of that looks pretty bad, but I think the eye said that they looked a bit more organised, they looked a bit more dangerous, a bit more structured, and they asked more questions of certain teams. That Collingwood game when they were 9 goals up, the Melbourne game in the wet, the Carlton game the second time, Gold Coast at Marvel, they just looked a little bit more like a football team, a little bit more structured. So,
which they haven't looked like.
No, exactly.
For a while.
They look like there was something there. So, I'd say they made progress, even if it might not have looked like it.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, was it this year or last year where we didn't have Alistair Clarkson for the first
last
few
year
games?
for a little bit?
Yeah. All right, cool. So they are some very interesting numbers, but yeah, as you said, to the eye, it looks different. I know a lot of North Melbourne supporters, and they were happier with this year compared to last year. So it's an interesting one. So let's get into the 2024 pass mark. All right, so heading into 2024, if you were a North Melbourne supporter, what would you have wanted to get out of this year?
Yeah, it depends how much stock you put in. I mean, the win-loss column is what it's all about at the end of the day. But if you accepted that North weren't ready to play finals, which they weren't, how much of it was about winning games and how much of it was about progressing and looking better? They didn't win more games. The belief was that they would be potentially able to climb out of the bottom 4. They didn't do that. Win-loss record was the same. But it just felt like after an awful couple of months, they were a little bit better. I mean, they don't get a pass because, a 3-20 season is a 3-20 season. But the disclaimer on that is how much of it was about wins and how much of it was about progress. So, I think they made progress without improving that win column.
Yeah.
And it's very important, obviously, psychologically to start beating some sides and getting some confidence.
I don't think anybody was predicting them to get out of the bottom 4. I think we should probably revisit our preseason predictions. I think I probably had them finishing second last. But where did you have them? Like at the start of the year.
Yeah, I guess there's our expectation and theirs. So I thought they would get better, win more games, but still finish bottom 4 based on, they'd have West Coast and Richmond and a few of those sides around them, but it would be hard for them to climb out of it. But you thought they might win 5 or 6 as opposed to 3. So I'd suggest that they would have felt they were capable of a little bit more than that, but maybe us as punters, not so much.
Yeah. Absolutely. All right, well, let's delve a bit deeper into some lowlights. Okay, so lowlights for North Melbourne, there's plenty to choose from, obviously, but I think we should probably start we probably have to mention Darren Thomas. Obviously, that was a pretty well-covered story, especially on Zero Hanger. We probably don't need to go into that, but that is probably the lowest point for the club this year. Again, probably don't need to go into it, so let's move now to Larky. Bit of a decline for he went from 71 goals back to 46 from the same number of games. Not ideal.
Yeah, and look, the role changes and they bring others in. Curtis had a pretty good influence in that forward line. He didn't have a bad year. I mean, a 46-goal season in a side that finished bottom 2 is nothing to sneeze at. But if you look at it, your same amount of games, kicked 25 less goals, had 35 less shots, same numbers in terms of marks and disposals, just had less scoreboard influence. Now, they needed to bring others into it, but not at the expense of, obviously, their main man. So still plenty of upside for him. And as we said, not a bad year by any means, but to go from 71 back to 46, 95 shots back to 60. We know he's very accurate, 46 goals, 14 for the season. But, yeah, they'd be hoping that he can get somewhere closer to the 2023 numbers while still getting the influence out of others. So he'd be one low light, as harsh as that sounds.
Yeah, I think that's just another thing that happens, especially with young key position players, where if they have a big breakout year, then you're going to get more attention from defenders the following year. So I guess it's kind of off the back of it, off a highlight, but yeah, unfortunate for Larky. So hopefully he brings it up next year. So let's move now to highlights. All right, so the highlights for North Melbourne this year. Loving this stat. 7 players averaged 20 or more disposals. So that's a pretty good sign that they're moving in the right direction.
Yeah, 5 last year, 7 this year. So they're getting a little bit more influence out of those players. And if you look at their general midfield improvements, so they were very poor in the first 10 or 11 weeks, but they went from 18th in the first 10 rounds to 2nd in the competition for contested possessions after that. 18th to 8th for ground ball gets in the same period, and 13th to 7th clearances in the same period. So if we look at them as having a very good young midfield with Wardlaw, McKercher, they now bring in O'Sullivan. Sheasel will spend a bit of time there going forward. LDU's not old by any means. They're getting really good results out of those players, and it made them more dangerous against good sides that we touched on earlier. I know Collingwood missed the finals, but still a solid outfit. That was a strong performance. Carlton likewise. So, yeah, I think there's certainly some positives for them.
Yep. So culture-wise as well, it looks like people want to stick around. We were at the draft earlier this year, and it was really nice to see, because, as you mentioned, Finn O'Sullivan, he got drafted, and he's a really exciting prospect to jump into that young midfield. And then all the other current young midfielders are there sort of getting around him, which I think is a really good sign for the club.
Yeah, and they kept mentioning, well, there were a lot of rumours around some disharmony because they're not winning games and, a lack of direction. But, Harry Sheasel signed until, I think, 2030. So, long deal. Comben, who's their future. Curtis in the forward line, who looked good. Tristan Jerry, who had that amazing season in the ruck. Bailey Scott. But also Cam Zurhaar. I think it was considered highly possible that he would move and finish his career somewhere else, but they've all extended, and that shows really good buy-in. Luke Davies-Uniacke hasn't re-signed yet, but he is repeatedly committing to the club in public. So I know St Kilda and a couple of others are circling around, but the words from his camp suggest that he would stay. So all of that, I think, is pretty positive that they're all on the same page and they're doing it together.
I think it might be a lesson learned from, obviously the Jason Horne-Francis episode that happened a couple of years ago. And, that might be one of those things that needs to happen to sort of make that younger group focus and stronger and really want to become a really strong culture and have that player retention focus. So, yeah. All right, so this next segment is brought to us thanks to Skills Beast, who have been helping AFL players of all skills levels transform their kicks. So, who transformed their game in 2024? We're going to name a player for each team, and for North Melbourne, Charlie Comben.
Yeah, he broke his leg quite badly early in his career and missed a large chunk of footy. He's had a stack of injuries. He was drafted as a forward primarily. He's now a swing man, primarily plays defence for North post Ben Mackay going to Essendon. Did a terrific job, but they threw him forward a couple of times late in the year. He kicked 3 1/4 in a game in there as well. So he'll continue to swing around a little bit, but has become a lot more defensively minded, played some really good games on really good players. So he's become incredibly important to what they're trying to do in a rebuild sense, North. So, he's a very good prospect, and good to see him, hold his body together after some bad luck, and they're getting the rewards for that.
Yeah, love to see it. Well done, Charlie Comben. All right, let's move over to the headlines. All right, so if there's one thing we know and love at Zero Hanger, it is headlines. So this year, North Melbourne, unfortunately, one of the main things that kept popping up in the news for North, apart from some of their performances, was Alistair Clarkson being in and out of the news.
Yeah, I mean, he's a passionate customer, and he can defend that quite fairly in terms of wanting to fly the flag for his team. But you go back to the start of the year when in that practice match when Jai Simpkin got knocked out by Jimmy Webster, and the words exchanged on the ground, and that got a few headlines. And then look, one that's got nothing to do with North Melbourne, the Hawthorn report, and how Clarko was obviously linked to that front and centre, and North wouldn't have wanted sort of those headlines floating around. And then a few of the others in terms of Clarko with losing his cool and that type of stuff. Look, I don't mind the flying the flag thing. Obviously there's a line that you can't cross, but and look, there are certain people within the media, as we probably know, that aren't necessarily huge Clarko fans, and they'll be quick to jump on that when it happens. So I think North would love it if he kept his head down and just went about the business, and they didn't hear too much about the other stuff.
Yeah. I mean, he's also been around for
correct
20 odd years or whatever. But like the racism saga stuff is something that I still think the AFL community, which is just a reflection of our wider society, is not great at discussing. So that is, it's very unfortunate. And then there's always that vision of Clarko punching a hole in the wall out of the coach's box, which I think just kind of sums up a lot of things about Clarko. So yeah, obviously that's a big headline for North this year. All right, so looking now at the player movement spaces, the ins and outs. So one that we haven't touched on, obviously we've had the trade period and the draft period, but the retirement of Jaden Stevenson was a pretty interesting one.
Yeah, it was. Citing a loss of passion for the game, and at his age, I know he's often been the subject of public scrutiny and criticism sometimes for second efforts and concentration and those sorts of things. But yeah, you wonder whether that's something that gets reversed over the course of the year. He might reignite that fire and want to go about it again, or he might just want to play footy with his mates. Who knows? But it's sad in a sense, but at the same time, you applaud someone for taking control and not accepting if they're not in the right place and making the decision that's in their best interest. So.
I love it. I like it. It's a high performance, industry, and if you just like, I can't be stuffed doing preseason and everything, may as well call it. Especially if you got something else that you want to do. But I think I did see recently too that he's got a a coaching sort of program going. So he's doing some interesting stuff now that he's not an AFL player. For the meantime, as he said, maybe he comes back at some point. But all the best to him. In terms of players gained, they had some interesting moves in the trade period and obviously the draft period. We did cover all of those at the time, but it's interesting now to look at it in sort of as a whole. We haven't done our best 23 for 2025 series yet. But, they gained Caleb Daniel, Jack Darling, Luke Parker. You'd imagine a lot of those guys might just slot straight in, but then with the draftees, Finn O'Sullivan looks ready-made to jump into that midfield. Yeah,
and a little bit of the for the now and for the future in all of that recruiting. I mean, Caleb Daniel, very good user of the ball, coming across from the Dogs. He could play half-back or push a little bit higher. Jack Darling was the interesting one. They were kind of in the mix for Jack Darling or Tim Membry, who ended up at Collingwood. They've gone with Jack Darling. Luke Parker spent a lot of the back end of the year at Sydney forward, but can obviously play on ball. Jacob Constanti, another young player that's sort of looking for opportunities. Darling can complement what they get out of Larkey and what they get out of Paul Curtis and Cam Zurhar and those sorts of players. But then Matt Whitlock, which was the interesting one on draft night when they traded a future first to get him as a long-term key position forward prospect who can work for them. Finn O'Sullivan, elite ball winner. And then River Stevens, the father-son selection, son of Anthony, of course, bit of a different player to his dad, but good to see that name continuing. You look at, they've already got Archer on the list as well as another father-son prospect. So that's a nice romantic one for them. He was, I think, pick 67 or thereabouts in the draft. So yeah, if you look at their net gains versus their net losses, so delisting Curtis Taylor, Charlie Lazaro, Hamish Free, and Blake Drury, and a couple of others, I think bringing in some of those experienced match-hardened players like Parker, Daniel, Darling, I think it puts them in a slightly more competitive position. O'Sullivan, another elite mid to join Wardlaw and McKercher and LDU and these really good crop of kids that they've got. So, yeah, tracking well.
Yeah, it does. It reminds me of, like, obviously I'm going to relate everything to Melbourne because I'm a D's fan, but some of these guys, it reminds me of that Paul Roos era in terms of that rebuild where you bring in guys like Caleb Daniel and Luke Parker, where the D's brought in, and then they weren't superstars like Daniel Cross, who was just a really elite trainer, like really set the standards of training, and then guys like Bernie Vince, like just people that have been around it for a long time. So I think it's a really...
I think Hibbard was another one, was he?
Yeah, Michael Hibbard was a great one. And then he came along with Malcolm as well, who's on the list. So I think that's really important, especially when you have, as you said, that young developing list. So, Clarko knows what he's doing. So. All right, so the big call for 2025, we're in December of 2024, but actually, no, it's technically November when we're filming this, but... You're looking at 2025, you're coming in, they've had the preseason. What is going to be a pass mark for them in 2025?
Yeah, we spoke at the start about, getting out of that bottom four, and I think North fans would quite rightly be frustrated maybe at how quickly some other sides bounce and how quickly they've been able to rebuild. North have been putting the blocks in place, but it has been slow progress. So I don't think anyone would argue with that. I think it's probably at the point now where they have to start stringing together those good patches and getting the rewards in terms of victories. They're not going to win 12 games, but if they could even double their win tally, go from 3 to 6, and then be, a chance to squeeze their way out of the bottom four, be competitive for longer, and start to show signs that the climb up the ladder is happening. So yeah, I would think that would be a more realistic target this year. Would be the same one we set last year, but get out of that bottom four, but certainly more achievable this time around.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree. You'd want to be out of the bottom four. Whether or not they'll do it, I don't know.
Again, that's exactly right. But they should expect to be, showing enough progress to pass a couple of sides this year.
Absolutely. That being said, I just have a feeling I know they're going to be the Demons next year, and I'm going to be really sad about it. All right. And that wraps it up for our season review for 2024 for the North Melbourne Kangas, Darren.
Roo. Yeah, they're a fascinating side, North. I think it's probably about time you start to see it translating. But they've got a really good squad. I think if you were handed the keys to North, you'd feel you got a bit to work with. So.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Thank you, Darren, and don't forget to like, comment, subscribe. We're going to be breaking down every team's 2024 season. We've already done one for West Coast featuring Will Schofield, so check that out on the channel. And stay subscribed. We've got lots of content coming in over the Christmas period, and we're going to start 2025 with a bang. So please subscribe and jump in the comments. This season review was brought to you by Skills Beast. Instantly kick better. Head to skillsbeast.com for more info.